Hello, everybody. Welcome to this remote Q&A session. This is going to be about microservices. In this session, I suppose I am trying to show a journey from script to microservices with some thoughts about what's going to happen next. It's important that we focus on the journey aspect. I'm going to cover all of this in the next 10 to 15 minutes. So this is supposed to be a Q&A session, so I didn't want to take the whole hour just talking to you. I'm going to spend the first 10, 15 minutes just describing what me and my colleagues have been working on in the past month, trying to evaluate our customers' journey effectively and get something from what they're doing, some insights. And after that, the floor is yours, the stage is yours. Ask questions, and hopefully we're going to have a good conversation. So a little bit about myself. My name is Riccardo. I'm your host today, and I joined Container Solutions a year ago, almost a year ago. It was May last year. Before that, I have been working with microservices for the past, let's say, 3-4 years. I have seen many forms of microservices being implemented. I worked with projects where we started with a microservice architecture design from the get-go. I work with migrations from Monolith to microservices. I've worked with starting with a microservice architecture, then realizing that wasn't really microservice. So we kind of reevaluated on the fly and adjusted from it. Right now, it's been like a year. I've been focusing more on serverless and serverless patterns and architecture, but many of the principles that we apply to microservices are still valid in the serverless world, even though in serverless there are a bit more limitations and we need to be a bit more careful. Again, if you guys have questions about that as well, feel free to ask. Right now, I'm going to share my screen just to show you what we've been working on with my colleagues for the past month, and then we go from there. So, share my screen. So hopefully now you can see what it's called the microservices maturity matrix. So this is, I think, a very good way to visualize a journey to microservice effectively. This is what we've been working on for the past month with my colleagues at Container Solutions. This is our attempt to see and maybe understand patterns that our customers, explore while they try to move to a microservice architecture effectively. During the journey, so moving from left to right, you can see kind of stages. You move from script to monolith to migration to microservice. Now, it's really important to understand that moving from left to right is not always achieving something better. You can have and deliver extremely good value to your organization if you stay in every stage. So for example, if we take the script stage, for example, script, is what we think of something that has like a procedural design. If you need to connect to some kind of web service. Maybe you don't actually configure, you don't have a configuration file, but you are code stuff in your script. The script only works on your machine, and there is no really release cycle, and you can only say whether the script is running or not. But script is extremely important. It's an extremely important stage because, well, everything was a script at the beginning. Google was a script 20, 25 years ago. But also, on a more concrete note, if you take, for example, I've been working on the website for one of the major newspapers here in the UK, and what we would do, we would create a form of A/B testing to test, for example, the color of the buttons, right? So these are really simple examples, but the way you do that is you actually write scripts to change the color of the button, and then you have a platform that offers one version of the button to some users and one version of and the other version of the buttons to other users, right? So those are all scripts that give an extreme, those are all extremely valuable scripts for an organization, right? To understand the user base. So that is a very good example of a script that actually delivers a lot of value. Now, if you move to the right of this maturity matrix, what normally happens after the script stage is our clients are normally in this phase. They have a monolith, right? So all their functionalities is in a single code base. There is some form of configuration management, the dependencies, the services, the monolith is depending on, and the URLs are in a configuration file, and this is just a simple example. The way we test monolith normally is with regression packs, maybe not even automated. We have some form of regular release cycle, but the time between release normally is very long, a month, 2 months, 6 months. Some companies even go one release per year, for example. In terms of observability, the only thing that we have in a monolith is logs. So we understand how the application behaves just by looking, just by writing log files. And we understand how if things go wrong by looking at log files. The only way to scale is by replicating the monolith, right? So if we see a spike in our user traffic, the only way for us to address that is to replicate the whole set of functionalities, right? So if just one functionality is in extreme need, we cannot just scale that single functionality. We have to replicate the whole thing, right? And these monoliths normally are run on application servers or some form of virtual machine. Now, moving to the right again, we start to see some of the techniques that are going to help us in our journey if we want to move to microservices. Now, at this stage, it's really important to understand whether we want to move or not to a microservice architecture, because monoliths and microservices are very different, and the way we deal with those is very different, and it does not always make sense for us to move to a microservice architecture. Team structure is really important, for example, to make these kind of decisions. but also from more of a technical side, monoliths tend to be easier to implement and to test and to release, even though the time that we need to do that might be longer, because with every version, we need to test every single functionality and we have to go through the whole process again. That process tends to be simpler. However, with microservice, the single service itself is more fine-grained and it's simple on its own. But if you take the whole ecosystem, the whole ecosystem is much more complex. You have dependencies that needs to be managed between services. You have to be more observant on practices like be more careful about your interfaces and how they evolve over time to avoid releasing more than one service at any given point in time. So the ecosystem is much more complex. So the way we move from a more simpler ecosystem to a more complex one is by introducing different kind of practices that are going to help us with managing the more complex scenarios that we find in a microservice architecture. So in terms of functionality, what we start to do is we start to decouple those functionalities, right? We start to isolate those functionalities that can be isolated. And we tend to group functionalities together that make sense to evolve together, right? So we start to move the dependencies not more on the code side, but on the domain side, if you want. So if I need a catalog before to display to the user before I, let's say I'm in the e-commerce world, I need to display products and then I need my user to make orders, those two can evolve separately, right? So we start to break dependencies effectively. Our configuration management change, we tend to move from a mutable infrastructure to an immutable infrastructure. So what this means is instead of reusing the same environment and upgrading, the libraries and the services that run on my application server, for example, we tend to recreate the whole application server every time. This, again, has pros and cons. In terms of testing, we start to introduce continuous integration. We start to introduce more automated form of testing that help us with understanding whether we are breaking dependencies before moving into later stages of our release cycle effectively. We start to monitor not just the output of our application, but also how the application runs. So in the observability category, let's say, we start to monitor things like, I don't know, CPU, and all kind of performance metrics. But these metrics are still related to the environment itself. So an example of this is, let's say I'm breaking down my catalog service and my order service. What I'm gonna start doing at this stage is I'm gonna start having performance metrics for the database, for example, that my order base uses, and the environment that my order service runs in. But they're still not related. But these metrics are still not related to each other. I don't have a full picture, if that makes sense. And then when I need to scale my services, I tend to do this manually. I don't have the practices in place and the platform in place yet to scale everything automatically. So I still rely on, try to predict what my user base is doing. A really trivial example of this is if you work on an e-commerce world, you know that Black Friday is a really busy day for your services. So you pre-allocate, you pre-scale your services beforehand, right? You know that's going to happen, so you react accordingly, effectively. And we start to move from running things in virtual machines to start running things into cloud or containers. So we are still in a situation where we have some service that are still part of the monolith. So they're still running in application servers or virtual machines, and the ones that I have isolated are running in containers, for example. So it's important to note that now at this stage, we are introducing practices that are good if I want to move back to monolith, right? So a lot of these practices are orthogonal, right? They don't have to progress with the evolution of my architecture. Good example of this is delivery, right? So these regular releases, continuous integration, continuous delivery. We can implement all of this if I stay in a monolith architecture. I can do continuous delivery with a monolith. However, introducing continuous integration is a good way for me to start moving towards a microservice architecture. So take this matrix as a way to understand what are the stages that we need to work on when I want to move to microservice. However, many of these practices are still valid if I want to stay in the monolith stage, right? So the final one, microservice. Once I am a master of splitting services, immutable infrastructure, and then I know CI, I can run CI every day, every minute, every pull request. And I know how to scale my services, then I can actually move into a bit more advanced stuff. So now my service become independent. I need to maybe design my services in a way that can be released independently, right? So the difference between the tightly coupled services and the independent services is that in the microservice stage, I can release service independently. I do not need to release more than one service at the same time to release a feature effectively. I start to use configuration and code and infrastructure as code. So all the dependencies of my service are in the same code base, well, depending on the school of thought. And everything can be released at the same time. Everything is repeatable. I can recreate my environments every time I want. I can create as many environments as I want, either one per pull request if I need to. In terms of testing, instead of running testing in the pre-prod environment and then move stuff into prod, I actually run some tests in the production environment. This gives me more confidence that my service will work correctly in the environment that is supposed to work in, right? So a good example of this is blue-green deployment, for example. You deploy the same application along the existing version of the application, you run your test in the same environment, and then you switch the pointer, right? So you make the new version of your application live, of your service live, and you do this continuously. Continuous delivery means you always have the next version ready to be delivered when the business wants to. Now, you also try to understand a bit better what's going on in your ecosystem, right? Because you have all these services that are there and they rely on each other to, offer the service. You also need to understand better what's going on in your system. The way to do this is you take all your metrics that you started generating in the migration phase, and you put them all together in one single place to understand better what's going on, right? To have a better idea of cause and effect. If one database is low, then this affects maybe one or more of the database dependencies. And your services will react to the user demand, right? It's not the other way. It's not the other way around. We're still gonna do the Black Friday, we are still gonna react to the Black Friday event, but we are also going to address smaller spikes that happen during the year in a reactive way. So it's my service that understands when it needs to go up and down. Effectively, and we are also standardizing the way we run all our services. So everything runs in containers and in a platform of our choice. We put Kubernetes here, but it can be any other. Now, one final minute, because I just realized I've taken too much time. On the next column, this is our guess of what's going to happen next. The idea is that instead of talking about services, we're going to start talking about functions. We are realizing that we can also version control the dependencies that there are between services. And GitOps is going to help us with solving that. The way we do testing so testing is an interesting one because up until the microservice, we are still trying to prevent errors, or at least this matrix is telling us prevent errors before we go to production, or here it's in production, but it's hidden, right, to our users. Whereas with techniques and practices like chaos engineering, this moves to actually what we call resiliency, right? So reacting to failures instead of preventing failures. So failures become the normal state of things, and we are constantly reacting to failures. So all the chaos monkeys and chaos Kongs are helping us to achieve that. And then progressive delivery, so it's continuous delivery with keeping in mind our users effectively. So it's a way of delivering, focusing on what our user needs. So A/B testing here becomes much more relevant, and we use techniques like canary and blue-green deployment to address user-specific needs. And then, we actually monitor every request that comes in, not just how the environment and the databases behave, but what the request does. So request tracing, we trace every single request that comes in, and we map it to each and every service that it needs to go through. Predictive autoscaling is a form of anticipating the needs, so we are ready. We scale preemptively in an automated way, and we try to abstract many of the configurations that we need to do right now with using Kubernetes and those kind of platforms, they will be offered as a service effectively. So this is an overview of what we think a good journey to microservices is. And now I am curious to understand your thought and your questions and what you guys want to cover in this session. So thank you very much for listening. And now the floor is yours. By the way, if you have any question that is not related to this, feel free to ask as well. If you start sleeping, that also tells me what I need to do for the next session. So let me know that as well.
I don't know if it's gonna help Ricky. Asking in general, asking the floor why they decided to join and what they were expecting from this session, and if this is what they had in mind, or if they want to share their stories, even if, as you said, they are completely unrelated to what you've just explained.
Yeah, definitely.
I have a question, I guess. After creating this, what was your strategy to make the changes to move to the microservices with your project? Or is that not related at all?
Right. So I guess this this is like this method is kind of it's an aggregation of stories from my projects and the ones I've done for my customers. So this is like a set of similar patterns that we kind of realized are happening in many organizations when they want to move to microservices. A lot of them are they are in the migration phase, right? So they are doing continuous integration. They're not quite there in continuous delivery. They are kind of lacking the performance and application metrics, and they are still uncertain on where they want to run their services. They are exploring containers and how to do things with them, but they're not there yet. However, many of these customers, their solution is, I am gonna do request tracing immediately, and I am gonna have a chaos monkey that is killing my services every time. And that, in my opinion, is kind of an anti-pattern for a successful migration. You need to focus at the right things at the right time, effectively, to make this happen. If you try to address problems that you still don't have with a solution, that solution is going to create more problems for you. Chaos engineering is a really good example, and request tracing is a really good example. Those are things that introduce a lot of problems, create a lot of problems if you haven't mastered what's before that, effectively. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
So a little bit over this, deeper on this question is there like a advice that is given to customers to, in this case, like not skip these previous steps towards reaching, let's say, the chaos engineering state? Is it like, yes. But you can actually, let's say, take a different path, like in this case, the customer will have automated pre-production testing and automated production testing, and then you can have chaos engineering without any other, without without having actually reached the other milestones for microservices. Is that also a acceptable?
So yes,
scenario?
however, you can try and optimize each one of the rows of these metrics. So you can try to move towards the right with testing and the way you orchestrate stuff, right? But you can't do too big of a spike, right? You need to follow each one of the categories here. You need to try to progress in each one of them, because each one of them gives you value, and everything kind of needs to happen together. So if you want to do chaos engineering, you need to be able to understand what's happening in your system, right? To actually react to the failures, right? You need to have a very good understanding of what's happening in your system, in your overall system, right? Not just in one service. Because if a service is down, what happens to its dependencies, right? So you need to have a good understanding of what's happening, and you can achieve that by moving to the right of the observability category, right? So you need to be at a certain stage to actually be able to do what's next. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Is there like a ideal strategy for this that is advised to customers? Like, is this, or does the strategy is try to move everything from monolith with one step to host migration and then finally to microservices? Is that the advice, or you can? And also the order of it, because for the business, sometimes you have to you can't do everything at the same time. And sometimes you have to choose what is more important, or that's all up to the business to decide what is important to them. Start to.
Yes, absolutely. So you can, the advice that we generally give is to take things slowly. Don't try to do everything at once. And I think this matrix kind of reflects that. There's lots of opportunity to go back to Monolith if you feel that what you're doing doesn't add value for you. Microservices is not for everybody. It needs to give value to the business. Otherwise, it's just a vanity project, right? The steps, right, that we try to do in the migration phase are, they move towards the microservice architecture. But if you master continuous integration, it's still going to add value if you want to go back to Monolith, right? Continuous integration you can apply to Monolith, and each one of these can be applied to Monolith as well. So yeah, generally take things slowly and evaluate, because the other thing that is not reflected in this matrix, this is more of the technical side of things. But microservices require also an organizational restructure. Team in general needs to be able to do to focus the life to follow the life cycle of the services they manage entirely, right? So we kind of need to move away from creating a ticket to have a new database to I need to be able to create my own database if I need one, right? So there is a shift, an organizational shift that needs to happen as well. And that as well takes time, right? So Any more thoughts on that? Does that answer the question?
Yes, thanks. On the side note, thing is, by looking at this matrix, I would think that isn't there like a product already in the market that would take away a lot of these steps actually, so that you can start to mold, like put your existing monoliths, start to split it up and put them into this new, let's say, this new platform where you don't actually have to build it completely from scratch, which I think that's what a lot of customers, I think they do, because they already have their existing tool set, which is a accumulation of many tools that they have used over the years, which in internet terms is already very old. Isn't there like a platform that you have experience with that will fill in many of those gaps, in this case, to reach the microservices state more quicker? Or the Kubernetes, because Kubernetes is pretty, I would say, bare platform just for running, and then you have a lot of other toolings needed around it to actually get to the.
Okay, so I think there is, and I think cloud providers actually are moving towards that direction already. The cloud providers, what they're doing are abstracting from us a lot of the things that, for example, we need to consider in our orchestration level, right? They are abstracting us from many of the problems that we would have, and many of our customers have, dealing with their monoliths, right? However, and this is especially true with serverless. Like in the past year, I've been working with serverless technologies, and what serverless technologies do really well, they effectively allow you to have an incredible level of, reactive autoscaling and all of that, and integrated metrics, and the way you can deliver stuff is extremely fast. They basically put you already almost at the end of this journey. However, to actually be able to release and do something meaningful with serverless, you need to be aware of what's happening, and you need to be able to understand how to use those platforms for what they can give you. So if you work with API gateway and Lambda functions, just to give you an example, you will see that there are many services around it. For example, X-Ray, that gives you already integrated metrics and some form of request tracing even. However, you need to be able to understand that to use serverless to its full potential, you need to rely on those things. Otherwise, I'm not going to say that your serverless purge is going to fail, but it's going to be much more difficult to maintain it. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I guess what I'm trying to say is that the cloud providers are moving us into that direction, but we need to be aware of the journey, and we need to be aware of what it means to release functions in productions effectively, and how we can do that effectively, right?
Yeah, I think you're very right on this. I was really wondering also whether there's a Cloud providers like AWS, they're sort of in the front line of this. And is there a, I would say, an alternative for those customers that want to keep everything in on-premise?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, there is. Open source, right? The cloud native, all the cloud native projects that are emerging right now. Mainly driven by Google, I would say. Kubernetes, Knative, Istio, and all the Grafana and all the new products that you can manage yourself if you want to. Those are the alternative, right? However, with open source, you always have the fact that you need to do the management of each one of those, right? So it becomes more difficult.
Yeah, thank you for answering.
Any other question?
Can I ask a non-super technical questions just out of curiosity?
Mm-hmm.
What was the most challenging part in creating and putting this matrix together?
I would say try to what was on, so hang on. The stages, I would say the stages were the most difficult part. So that's because we wanted to give an idea of a journey. So monolith to microservice, right? But the fact is that if you put that on a matrix, it means that what's on the right is better. However, in this case, it's not, because it's very situational, right? So I would say actually try to give context to this matrix without giving context. So if you see this, you need to understand it's about the journey. It's not about the technology itself. And some people do understand that, some people don't. But it's a really good conversation starter, I would say.
Oh, thanks.
Any other question, anyone? Feel free, it's your time.
If you also want to try to tell us where do you see yourself in this matrix, that would be really useful as well, I would say.
I have a slight idea about this matrix. Have you considered to sort of assign points or something to each of those states, and then someone can calculate where they are or something, or how they are doing with regard
yes,
to
that is a very good idea. It's really dangerous as well. So we might do this internally, you know, to decide whether we want to work with the client or not. I'm just joking. But it's also very, very difficult because each one of these things might make sense or not, depending on the situation of you know, your situation effectively. So this is kind of trying to encompass generic issues and pattern, but then when we go and assess each and every client, we try to tailor this to their needs effectively.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking is that I think a lot of like managers, they will think, oh, where we are now, let's say they are in current state, let's say 0, and then they will get into this journey. At the end of the journey, they will be at I don't know, with point 3 points in this case. That's assuming every dot is 1 point.
Yeah. That is a nice idea to convey the message. Absolutely.
But yeah, it's a really nice matrix. I really like it a lot. I think
Thank you.
You guys put it together.
I think we can cut it if there's no more questions, so we don't stare at each other in silence.
For 10 minutes, yeah, definitely. Okay, so I would say thank you all for joining. Again, if you think of other questions, feel free to ask them on Twitter or our email. We'll be in touch. And yeah, thank you all.